Hello guys, today we are going to dive into a story that isn't told in history books with glamour or heroism, but one that is raw, gritty, and closer to the real experience of being a tank crewman for Germany during the Second World War. Imagine the roar of an engine beneath you, metal grinding under pressure, the smell of oil and sweat mixing, and the constant, gnawing tension that creeps in whether you are moving through open fields, muddy forests, or bombed-out towns. I'm curious, where are you listening from right now, and what time is it where you are? It's always fascinating to know which corner of the world is hearing these tales of tanks, tracks, and survival. Life inside a Panzer was unlike anything civilians could ever imagine. The metal box you called your home could feel both protective and suffocating, a paradox that made every moment inside a blend of security and claustrophobia. The seats were narrow, designed for efficiency rather than comfort, and every jolt over rough terrain reminded you that the tank was alive, that it demanded respect. The smell of burnt fuel mixed with the dampness of the metal interior. Oil dripped from pipes that no one had time to fix properly, and the sound of gears grinding under stress was constant. Crew members often joked that if you could survive a day inside a Panzer without snapping, you were ready for almost anything. Meals were another story. On the move, sustenance was often canned, cold, or whatever scraps could be scavenged from abandoned villages or supply convoys. Sausages, a thin slice of bread, sometimes a lump of hard cheese, and occasionally, when luck struck, a small tin of stew that had traveled further than the soldiers themselves. Eating was rarely leisurely. The tank jolted, tracks clanking, shells sometimes exploding nearby, and you learned to shovel in food while holding onto something so you wouldn't slide across the cramped interior. There was no time for delicacy. Yet, these small moments of eating together became strangely comforting, a brief break from the mental exhaustion that hovered over every crewman. The hierarchy inside the tank was strict but unspoken in many ways. The commander gave orders, the driver obeyed, the gunner watched every movement of the battlefield through periscopes, and the loader kept the ammo ready, hands always moving. There was no room for ego, yet camaraderie grew in silent ways. A shared glance over a sight line, a subtle nod when someone executed a maneuver perfectly, a joke whispered in the dark when the engines cooled for a few moments, all small acts that kept morale alive. You realized that surviving wasn't just about skill, it was about trust, an unspoken bond that connected 4, sometimes 5 men in a coffin of steel that could be pierced by a single shell. Recreation was strange and minimal, often improvisational. When stationed at a rear base or behind the front lines, some crews would play cards, share letters from home, or even write crude poetry about their experiences, but every laugh carried the weight of knowledge that it could be the last one. Some crews improvised games using shell casings or stones, testing aim or just trying to break the monotony, and stories of small mischiefs often circulated in whispered conversations when higher-ranking officers were away. Rumors spread faster than reality. Who had survived the last engagement, who had panicked in battle, which tanks had been lost, and sometimes the tales were so exaggerated that they seemed unbelievable, yet everyone listened anyway because in the tank, a story was a lifeline. Sleep inside a tank was a luxury and often impossible. Crew members took turns resting in awkward positions, sometimes with one shoulder pressed against the engine, the other against the steel hull. Dreams were interrupted by every clank and groan of the machine, and nightmares weren't uncommon, especially after encountering enemy fire. Many claimed that after weeks in constant movement, your mind began to blend reality and hallucination. A shadow outside could be an enemy soldier, or a trick of the light reflecting on mud, and you learned to react instantly anyway. Fear became second nature, and yet, strangely, boredom also became a companion. There were hours of silence, watching forests, fields, and ruined towns pass by, and in those moments, your mind wandered to home, to family, to things that seemed trivial now but were deeply missed. The tanks themselves were fascinating machines, full of quirks that only those inside could understand. The throttle had a rhythm, a pulse, almost like the heartbeat of the vehicle. Clutching the controls, you felt connected to every movement, every turn, every bump. Sometimes, if the mechanics weren't perfect or if maintenance had been rushed, the engine would overheat or the tracks would jam, leaving you vulnerable. Panic didn't always help. calm precision often saved lives. Crewmen became intimate with every inch of their tanks, knowing the weak points, the stubborn bolts, the spots where mud collected and slowed movement. It was both a partnership and a prison. The psychological toll was immense. Even when not in combat, anxiety lingered. A distant explosion, the whistle of artillery, the rumble of approaching engines, all triggered adrenaline in ways that never fully subsided. Letters from home brought joy but also despair, reminding soldiers of the lives waiting for them, of childhood friends already lost, and of a world that continued far beyond the chaos they were trapped in. Conversations were often muted, pauses filled with a quiet tension that no one dared to break for long. Humor became dark, sarcastic, and sharp-edged, a necessary shield against despair. The days blurred together, the world outside the tank transforming into a canvas of gray mud, shattered trees, and skeletal buildings that whispered of lives abruptly halted. Each engagement left its mark, not just on the landscape, but on the men inside. You learn to read the silence as much as the chaos. A sudden stillness might mean an ambush ahead, or it could be the calm before a storm of artillery shells raining down from above. Sometimes, the tank would lurch unexpectedly over hidden craters, and for a moment, the world turned upside down in a terrifying but strangely routine way, leaving everyone gripping whatever they could. Ammo was precious, and loading it became a rhythm, a dance performed in a cramped, overheated coffin of steel. Each shell had its weight, each movement its importance, and mistakes were unforgiving. The gunner's eye stayed glued to the periscope as the loader handed over round after round, sweat mingling with grime, and the commander barked instructions, sometimes in clipped German, sometimes in exasperated shouts. Coordination became instinctive. Even a single hesitation could mean the difference between survival and destruction. Yet, when the firing stopped, there was a strange calm, an almost eerie lull where the echoes of explosions seemed to linger in the metal walls like ghosts. Maintenance was a relentless part of survival. Tracks were inspected constantly, engines oiled and tuned whenever there was a sliver of downtime, and minor fixes were often improvised with whatever tools were at hand. Mechanics became a language in itself. A specific clank, a subtle vibration, or the smell of overheating metal could indicate trouble before it became life-threatening. Sometimes, the tank had to be pushed manually through mud, the crew working together as a unit against the stubborn grip of the earth, while bullets or shells occasionally ricocheted nearby, reminding everyone that there was no real, safe moment. Food, when it came, was sometimes an adventure of its own. A supply truck might arrive, or a local farmer's abandoned storage could be scavenged. There were moments of delight over something as simple as a chunk of sausage or a small loaf of bread. Tea was a rare comfort, brewed from powdered leaves mixed with lukewarm water, and it became a ritual that signaled brief respite. Meals were often eaten in silence, not out of hostility but because silence allowed reflection, and reflection allowed the mind a temporary escape from the constant hum of engines, the clatter of metal, and the ever-present fear. Stories circulated within the tank, some based on truth, some wild exaggerations, each adding to the mythology of the crew. One man claimed he had survived being hit by a shell that should have obliterated the entire tank. Another swore he saw the face of a comrade appear outside the periscope only to vanish as the vehicle moved. These tales were part entertainment, part mental exercise, a way to cope with the absurdity and horror that was ordinary life inside a panzer. You laughed, listened intently, and sometimes even whispered them to new recruits, passing down a strange, intimate history of survival. Rest was fleeting, often interrupted by the needs of the tank or the sudden roar of artillery. Sleep, when it came, was taken in shifts, curled against cold metal, blankets sharing space with oil stains. Dreams were fragmented, often invaded by the smell of gunpowder or the sound of engines. Some men began to notice that their dreams bled into reality. A creak in the metal might trigger a startle reflex, a shadow could be misinterpreted, and yet, slowly, the mind adapted. It learned to distinguish, to survive, but at a cost. Every man carried fragments of fear, fatigue, and memory like shards in the chest, invisible yet heavy. Entertainment was improvisational. A deck of cards, smuggled or handed down from a rear base, could occupy an entire night. Men would challenge each other, wager small scraps, or invent games that took advantage of the cramped interior. Laughter, when it came, was sharp and sudden, like lightning, illuminating the dark corners of the tank. Sometimes it was nervous, sometimes genuine, but always fleeting, disappearing as quickly as it arrived when the engine rumbled back to life or distant artillery began its rhythm once more. The connection between men and their tanks was profound. You learned every sound, every vibration, every quirk. A stubborn lever, a track that rattled more than usual, a throttle that hesitated, all were warnings, cues, or invitations to act. The tank became more than a machine. It became an extension of the crew, a partner, a protector, a cage, and a constant reminder of mortality. You realized that your survival depended not only on skill but on intuition, trust, and a deeply ingrained understanding of the vehicle and the men beside you. Rumors and news traveled slowly, yet inside the tank they seemed immediate and vital. Whispers of lost comrades, victories gained and lost, or strange occurrences at distant fronts spread with astonishing speed, filling gaps between reality and imagination. One moment, the crew discussed a battle that had already ended days ago. The next, a tale of a tank appearing where it shouldn't have, disappearing before anyone could verify it. These stories, often contradictory, became part of the mental landscape, feeding anxiety, hope, or grim amusement. The world outside the tank often seemed unreal. Villages were reduced to rubble, forests bore the scars of artillery, and rivers flowed with the debris of destruction. Yet life persisted in small, unnoticed ways. A bird flitting between broken walls, a dog scavenging for scraps, children peeking from basements to witness the monstrous metal beasts that had become the norm. These moments of unexpected normality reminded the men inside the tank of the life that continued beyond their cramped steel world. Life they were no longer fully part of, life they simultaneously yearned for and feared losing. Movement through the landscape became a rhythm all its own. Days stretched endlessly, punctuated by sudden bursts of terror or the low hum of the engine as the tank trundled through mud, over craters, past shattered homes, and along roads that seemed to vanish under layers of dirt and debris. Visibility was often limited, windows and periscopes offering only fragments of the outside world, and every shadow or shift in light required immediate attention. The crew learned to communicate in subtle gestures, brief nods, and clipped words that conveyed far more than ordinary conversation could. A glance at the controls, a tilt of the head, a hand motion toward the periscope, all became part of a silent language of survival that only those inside truly understood. Water was scarce, and the ways of finding it often strange. Occasionally, a stream could be forded, or rain collected in whatever containers were available. Men learned to ration, to sip slowly, and to recognize the value of even the smallest drop. Boiling water was a luxury, often foregone in favor of cold sips, and yet, during brief respites, a warm drink, however small, could lift spirits in ways that nothing else could. Conversations during these moments sometimes drifted toward memories of home, gardens, kitchens, the smell of fresh bread, and laughter that felt almost alien compared to the grim reality surrounding them. The tank's engine demanded attention beyond the ordinary. Noise became a companion, a warning system, and sometimes an adversary. Every clunk, hiss, and vibration held meaning. A subtle misalignment of gears, a creeping rise in temperature, the grinding of tracks over stones and mud. You became attuned to these signals almost instinctively, reacting before conscious thought had time to process them. A poorly maintained engine wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a death sentence in a field of conflict where the enemy's eye was as sharp as your own. And yet, despite constant maintenance, breakdowns occurred, often at the worst possible moment, leaving the crew vulnerable and forcing them to improvise repairs with a mixture of skill, intuition, and sheer desperation. Conversations inside the tank often veered between the absurd and the morbid. Crews shared rumors about who had survived impossible situations, the strange phenomena witnessed on distant battlefields, and even tall tales of tanks that seemed almost supernatural in their resilience. Laughter came and went, sharp and fleeting, dissolving as quickly as it appeared when a sudden jolt of the tank reminded everyone of the danger that never truly left. Humor became a coping mechanism, a thin shield against the mental strain of hours and days compressed into a metal shell. Even small debates, over whose turn it was to fetch water, the best method for loading a stubborn shell, or the correct way to navigate a tricky patch of terrain, carried weight, blending necessity with subtle competition that kept minds sharp. Sleep remained a fleeting, precarious luxury. Positions were uncomfortable, curled against metal, pressed against fellow crew members, blankets and oil stains mingling in awkward, sweaty tangles. Nightmares intruded, fueled by memories of explosions, the faces of fallen comrades, and the mechanical sounds of the tank itself. Dreams often bled into reality, shadows outside the periscope or the unexpected squeal of metal triggering immediate, instinctive responses. The mind adapted, but the cost was clear. Every man carried a burden of constant alertness, fragmented rest, and lingering fear that was impossible to fully shake. The landscape itself became a silent storyteller. Forests bore the scars of artillery, fields were littered with debris, and rivers ran thick with mud, bodies, and the remnants of destroyed vehicles. Occasionally, fleeting moments of life intruded. A bird darting across the open field, a dog scavenging near ruins, children cautiously watching from cellars or broken doorways. These glimpses of normality were brief, often heart-wrenching, reminding the crew of lives that continued even as their own world had narrowed into the confines of the tank. You longed for these glimpses, yet they also carried the weight of what had been lost, what could never return, and the strange dissonance of participating in destruction while observing life endure. Rumors continued to flow through the crew, mixing fact and fiction until it was often impossible to separate the two. One man swore he had seen an enemy tank disappear into thin air. Another claimed that a village had been evacuated in a matter of hours, yet no report would ever confirm either story. These tales, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted in excitement, became part of the mental environment, filling idle moments and providing a distraction from the constant hum of engines, the smell of fuel, and the ever-present tension of potential combat. Life inside the tank was a constant negotiation with boredom and terror, monotony and adrenaline. There were endless hours of waiting, punctuated by moments of chaos that demanded every ounce of skill, concentration, and instinct. Yet in this strange rhythm, bonds formed, a silent camaraderie that no outside observer could fully comprehend. Trust became absolute, communication almost instinctive, and humor, dark, sarcastic, fleeting, was the lifeline that tethered men to sanity. The days stretched on with a relentless sameness, yet each one carried its own subtle dangers and surprises that kept the crew alert. Mud caked the tracks, dripping onto boots and uniforms, and rain turned fields into slick traps that tested both the tank's power and the driver's nerve. Visibility could vanish in an instant as fog rolled in or dust clouds stirred by artillery fire enveloped the landscape, leaving men inside to rely on instinct and coordination alone. The smallest mistake, a misjudged slope, a momentary lapse in attention, could send the tank tipping or trapped, vulnerable to enemy fire or environmental hazards, and the consequences were often immediate and unforgiving. Inside, the air was thick with smells that never left the memory: burnt oil, metal, sweat, and occasionally the faintly sweet aroma of rationed chocolate or a tin of preserved fruit, moments of strange comfort amidst the relentless grime. Each breath reminded the men that they were alive, yet always on edge, sensing danger in every clank and groan of the machinery around them. Engines roared or coughed irregularly, periscopes offered fragmented glimpses of a changing world outside, and shadows danced across walls that were only inches from your face. The tank was simultaneously a haven and a trap, a partner in survival that demanded respect and constant attention. Meals became exercises in adaptation and patience. Tinned meat, dry bread, and powdered soup were the staples, and yet each small taste could feel like a feast after days of deprivation. Sometimes scavenged vegetables or a rare piece of fruit would appear, and such moments sparked quiet celebrations inside the cramped space, laughter muffled by the metal walls but heartfelt nonetheless. Eating together became a ritual, not only to nourish the body but to anchor the mind, a brief return to human normality amid the mechanical chaos and omnipresent threat of enemy engagement. The hierarchy within the tank dictated every movement, yet subtle bonds of respect and understanding often overrode strict orders. The commander's eyes were constantly scanning, assessing threats and opportunities, while the driver felt every vibration beneath the tracks. The gunner's focus was unwavering, and the loader's hands were never still, passing shells with a rhythm that seemed choreographed. Each man's skill was essential, but it was the silent trust and intuition that developed over countless days together that made survival possible. A subtle nod, a glance, a whispered warning could avert disaster, and the absence of such coordination could be catastrophic. Rumors and stories continued to occupy idle moments, some entertaining, some terrifying, all memorable. Tales of tanks surviving impossible hits, comrades performing unbelievable feats under fire, or eerie, unexplained events on distant battlefields became part of the mental landscape, filling gaps between action and waiting. Even when the tales seemed impossible, they carried a strange weight of truth, reflecting both hope and fear, and served to bond the crew, providing shared reference points in a world where certainty was rare and fleeting. Sleep remained elusive. Resting in a cramped metal box, surrounded by the constant vibration and occasional jolt, required unnatural patience and flexibility. Crew members curled against each other or pressed against cold surfaces, blankets mingling with oil and dirt. Dreams were fragmented, sometimes invaded by memories of explosions or the faces of fallen comrades. The boundary between dream and reality blurred, and waking up became a cautious process. A shadow might trigger a startle reflex, a sudden noise could be mistaken for enemy fire, and yet men adapted, learning to rest while remaining partially alert, a skill that blurred the line between survival and torment. The terrain outside told its own story, often in silence. Bombed villages, forests scarred by artillery, and fields pockmarked with craters created a grim tableau of human conflict. Occasionally, glimpses of normal life intruded. A bird flitting across the ruins, a stray animal searching for food, children peeking from damaged homes. These moments, brief and fleeting, reminded the crew of the world beyond the tank, a life both distant and unattainable, and they stirred feelings of longing, melancholy, and the rare spark of hope that some semblance of normality might endure even in the midst of destruction. Maintenance never ceased. Every movement, every vibration, every sound demanded attention. Tracks had to be checked, engines oiled, gears inspected, and improvised repairs were a constant necessity. Even the smallest oversight could escalate into a life-threatening failure, and yet there was a rhythm to the labor, a strange satisfaction in keeping the massive machine alive and moving despite the odds. Crew members became intimately familiar with every inch of their tank, understanding its quirks, its weaknesses, and its potential in ways that no one outside could ever imagine. Communication inside the tank was as subtle as it was essential. Gestures, brief words, eye contact, even the timing of a breath became part of a complex language that conveyed orders, warnings, and reassurance. There was no room for hesitation or misunderstanding. Every message had weight, and each man had to be in tune with the others, responding instinctively to maintain cohesion. Mistakes were rare, learned from quickly, and never repeated, because the cost was too high. Moments of humor and human connection were precious, often brief, and sometimes dark. A joke whispered, a playful challenge during a lull, or a sarcastic comment about the latest rumor could lift spirits, even if only momentarily. Laughter became a lifeline, a small rebellion against the constant tension and omnipresent danger. It reminded the men that despite the chaos, despite the machinery, despite the war, they were still human, capable of emotion, connection, and fleeting joy even in a world defined by destruction and uncertainty. The monotony of travel was deceptive, masking dangers that could appear without warning. Roads that seemed safe moments ago could be riddled with mines, and open fields often hid the silent threat of enemy ambushes. Each jolt or sudden vibration brought a surge of adrenaline as the crew instinctively braced for impact. Even in moments of relative calm, The men remained hyper-aware, every glance toward a periscope or window scanning for movement that could indicate danger. Time inside the tank had a strange elasticity. Hours stretched like days during long treks across devastated landscapes, yet minutes could explode into lifetimes when combat erupted without warning. The smell inside the tank was omnipresent, a mixture of sweat, metal, oil, and sometimes the faint remnants of food or tobacco. Breathing deeply became a skill, learned over time, and yet even the harshest odors could provide a sense of grounding. It was the smell of survival, of existence in a confined, moving world, and in strange ways, it became familiar, almost comforting, a constant amid chaos. Crew members joked about it at times, but only lightly, because there was an unspoken understanding that any distraction could be costly. Food, when available, was ritualized in tiny, almost sacred moments. A tin of beans, a sliver of sausage, or a hard, dry bread became more than sustenance. They were brief celebrations of normality. Men would share what little they had, sometimes creating makeshift meals that were ingenious in their simplicity, adding salt or scraps of vegetables scavenged from the countryside. These moments, though small, held profound meaning, reinforcing bonds and providing temporary relief from the relentless pressure of the battlefield. Even the act of pouring water or steeping a bitter tea carried weight, marking a brief pause in the otherwise continuous march of duty and danger. The interior of the tank dictated behavior and rhythm. The driver learned to anticipate every clunk and groan, the gunner tracked targets with a combination of skill and instinct, and the loader kept shells moving with a precision that seemed almost choreographed. Commands were clipped and efficient, words often unnecessary as gestures and eye contact conveyed meaning with perfect clarity. This silent communication, developed over weeks and months, became vital for survival. One misread motion, 1 second too slow, could have consequences that no man inside wanted to face. Yet, within this tension, a strange harmony existed. The crew moved as one, each man anticipating the next, a single entity in a machine of steel. Rumors persisted, spreading like wildfire in the confines of the tank. Stories of miraculous survivals, legendary feats, and near-impossible escapes became part of the crew's shared mythology. Some were terrifying, others comical, and a few blurred the line between fact and fantasy. The men listened, repeated, and sometimes altered these stories, weaving them into the tapestry of their shared experience. In a world where certainty was rare, and control often an illusion, these tales provided structure, a kind of mental ballast that kept fear at bay, if only for a short while. Sleep remained fragmented, often reduced to stolen moments while the tank moved slowly across terrain or paused behind a ridge. Positions were cramped and uncomfortable, blankets and oil-stained clothing pressing against every surface. Dreams intruded unpredictably, sometimes mirroring the chaos outside, sometimes taking strange, surreal turns that left a lingering sense of unease upon waking. Rest was an exercise in balancing alertness and exhaustion, learning to relax just enough to recover without allowing vulnerability to creep in. Over time, the mind adapted, developing a unique resilience, though never fully escaping the omnipresent tension that defined life inside the tank. The outside world was both familiar and alien. Ruined villages, blasted forests, and craters filled with stagnant water became the backdrop of every journey. Occasionally, life peeked through, a fox darting across a field, a stray horse wandering between destroyed homes, or children watching cautiously from the shadows. These glimpses of normality were fleeting yet poignant, reminders of a world beyond the tank, a life suspended just out of reach. The crew felt both longing and detachment, aware that survival demanded immersion in destruction while yearning for the peace that seemed increasingly distant. Maintenance never ceased. Tracks had to be inspected, engines oiled, and mechanical faults corrected with whatever tools and ingenuity were available. Even minor errors could escalate into life-threatening failures. The crew developed an intimate understanding of every component, anticipating problems before they became critical and improvising repairs under pressure. This constant vigilance, combined with experience and instinct, became a defining feature of life inside the tank, a continuous dance between man and machine, survival and catastrophe. Communication remained subtle, yet indispensable. Every glance, hand gesture, and intonation carried meaning, guiding actions with precision. Commands could be whispered or entirely silent, conveyed through understanding developed over long months of shared experience. The margin for error was minimal. Miscommunication could be deadly. Yet this intense reliance on mutual understanding forged bonds that were nearly unbreakable, a testament to the resilience and adaptability of men forced to live in such extreme confinement. Moments of levity were rare but treasured. A joke, a sarcastic remark, or a whispered story could briefly lift the weight of tension, creating fleeting relief and reminding men that humor was a survival tool, as essential as the shell in the loader's hands or the precision of the gunner's aim. Laughter, though often brief and nervous, became a shared language, an invisible thread connecting men through fear, fatigue, and the relentless grind of war. The landscape outside seemed endless, a chaotic tapestry of destruction and nature struggling to reclaim what had been torn apart. Every kilometer traveled demanded attention. Trees that survived artillery, tangled hedgerows, and half-collapsed buildings became both cover and hazard. The crew learned to anticipate the way the land shifted beneath the tank's tracks, each rut, puddle, or hidden ditch requiring split-second decisions. Even in moments of calm, the threat was omnipresent. A misjudged turn, a soft patch of mud, or an unseen crater could immobilize the tank, leaving the crew exposed and vulnerable. Survival depended on a blend of experience, intuition, and constant vigilance, a rhythm that consumed every thought and movement. Inside, the tank was alive in ways outsiders could never understand. Metal groaned, engines hissed, and hydraulic systems pumped under strain. Every sound carried meaning, from the subtle tremor of a loose bolt to the rhythmic thrum of tracks moving over uneven terrain. Crew members became attuned to these nuances, reading the machine as one might read a living being. The smell of oil, sweat, and fuel mingled with the faint traces of food, and each breath reminded the men that they were both part of the tank and separate from it, tethered to survival by instinct, skill, and sheer willpower. Food remained a rare pleasure, yet it provided structure in an otherwise unpredictable existence. Cans of meat, dried bread, and preserved vegetables were staples, but when luck intervened, fresh provisions from abandoned villages or rare deliveries elevated morale. The act of preparing and sharing a meal became almost ritualistic, a temporary escape from the tension that defined every hour. Tea, bitter and thin, became a small comfort, a moment of warmth and normality that reminded men of home, even if only briefly. Conversation often accompanied these meals, ranging from memories of family to debates over trivial matters, offering a reprieve from the constant threat outside. The hierarchy within the tank was both rigid and flexible. The commander made decisions, but experience and intuition often dictated the unspoken flow of responsibility. The driver felt the nuances of every vibration, anticipating the engine's behavior. The gunner's eye tracked targets with lethal precision. The loader moved shells with practiced rhythm. Orders were communicated through brief commands, gestures, or even eye contact, a language born of necessity. Mistakes were rarely forgiven, and yet trust grew in subtle ways, an unspoken acknowledgement of skill, reliability, and shared risk. Rumors and stories thrived in the confined space. Tales of miraculous survival, absurdly narrow escapes, and strange occurrences spread quickly, filling the gaps between action and waiting. Some stories were terrifying, others comical, but all served a purpose. They distracted, entertained, and reinforced bonds within the crew. Even the most outlandish tales became part of the shared mental landscape, offering both hope and a framework for understanding the unpredictable world beyond the tank's walls. Sleep was precarious, stolen in fragments between missions and maintenance. The cramped interior forced men into awkward, uncomfortable positions, pressed against metal and fellow crew members, blankets mingling with grime and sweat. Dreams often invaded with violence or surreal imagery, leaving lingering unease even upon waking. Yet the mind adapted, learning to balance rest with alertness, to relax just enough to recover without compromising vigilance. Over time, the crew developed a resilience unique to their environment, a mental fortitude shaped by necessity and constant exposure to danger. The outside world alternated between stark devastation and fleeting reminders of life. Villages reduced to rubble, forests scarred by artillery, and fields littered with debris dominated the scenery, yet small signs of continuity appeared unexpectedly. Birds darted across open fields, stray animals scavenged among ruins, and children sometimes peeked from cellars or broken doorways. These glimpses of normality were ephemeral but powerful, reminding the crew of the humanity beyond their confined steel world, a life they yearned for but could no longer fully inhabit. Maintenance consumed both time and energy, an unending cycle of inspection, repair, and improvisation. Tracks had to be aligned, engines oiled, bolts tightened, and minor faults corrected before they escalated into catastrophe. Crew members became intimately familiar with the tank, its idiosyncrasies and vulnerabilities, understanding its rhythm and anticipating its needs. The machine was both a lifeline and a prison, and survival depended on mastery over its complexities as much as skill in combat. Communication remained subtle and precise. Gestures, brief commands, and shared glances conveyed orders, warnings, and reassurance. Every movement carried meaning, and the margin for error was minimal. Miscommunication could lead to disaster, yet the reliance on intuition and mutual understanding forged bonds that were nearly unbreakable. Men learned to anticipate one another's actions, moving as a single organism within the confined, vibrating metal shell that was both their protector and their battlefield. Moments of levity were rare but treasured. A whispered joke, a sarcastic remark, or a brief story could lift the suffocating tension, providing temporary relief from relentless monotony and fear. Laughter, though fleeting, became a shared language, a fragile but vital connection that reminded men of their humanity amidst the chaos. Even as the tank lurched through mud, dodged unseen hazards, and engaged in deadly encounters, these small sparks of humor persisted, sustaining morale and forging bonds that would endure beyond the immediacy of survival. Movement never truly stopped, even when it seemed the world had fallen silent. The tank rolled forward over mud, shattered roads, and cratered fields, each journey testing patience, skill, and nerves. The terrain was unpredictable, often hiding dangers beneath a deceptively calm surface. A soft patch of mud could trap the tracks, an unseen ditch could pitch the tank violently, and every shadow could conceal a threat. The crew learned to read the land instinctively, anticipating obstacles and reacting before conscious thought could intervene. Every meter traveled was a negotiation with the environment, a test of coordination, skill, and constant awareness that became almost second nature over time. Inside, the tank was both home and torment. Metal walls confined the crew, pressing in during moments of panic and echoing with the sounds of engines, gears, and the occasional distant artillery. The scent of oil, sweat, and machinery was inescapable, mingling with faint traces of food or tobacco. Each breath reminded men that they were alive but never entirely safe. The hum and vibration of the machine became a companion, a constant presence that was at once comforting and suffocating. Crew members learned to synchronize with the tank's rhythm, anticipating its groans and shudders as though the vehicle itself were a living entity demanding respect, attention, and care. Meals were an exercise in improvisation and resilience. Canned meat, hard bread, and preserved vegetables formed the bulk of the diet, yet each morsel carried significance. Scavenged produce or rare deliveries became highlights, moments that offered fleeting comfort and camaraderie. The preparation and sharing of food, even in the cramped, moving interior, reinforced bonds, provided structure to an otherwise chaotic existence and reminded men of the life they had left behind. A sip of bitter tea or a bite of chocolate became a small victory, a temporary triumph over monotony and deprivation. The hierarchy within the tank dictated the flow of action but coexisted with unspoken mutual respect. The commander issued orders with precision, but instinct and experience guided many decisions. The driver felt the terrain through every vibration, The gunner tracked targets with unwavering focus, and the loader's hands never rested, moving shells with a rhythm honed over months of practice. Communication relied on brevity, gestures, and eye contact. Every motion had meaning. Mistakes were dangerous, sometimes fatal, yet trust and intuition grew within these constraints, forming a silent language of survival that bound the crew together more tightly than words ever could. Stories and rumors persisted, blending fact and fiction into a shared mental landscape. Tales of miraculous escapes, legendary feats, or strange phenomena circulated quickly, offering distraction and entertainment. Even the most implausible stories carried weight, providing mental scaffolding in a world where certainty was scarce. Sharing these narratives became a ritual, a means of coping, and a subtle reinforcement of solidarity. Each retelling added color, suspense, and sometimes dark humor, enriching the crew's collective memory while preparing them psychologically for the unpredictable. Sleep was elusive, often claimed in stolen intervals while the tank idled or moved slowly. The cramped space forced men into awkward positions, pressed against metal and one another, blankets intermingled with oil, dirt, and sweat. Dreams intruded unpredictably, often reflecting the violence outside or twisting reality into surreal forms. Yet over time, the crew adapted, learning to rest while maintaining enough alertness to respond to immediate danger. The skill of sleeping under these conditions became a subtle art, blending endurance, awareness, and an acceptance of discomfort as a constant companion. The outside world alternated between devastation and fragile reminders of life. Burned villages, forests scarred by artillery, and cratered fields dominated the view, yet occasional glimpses of persistence appeared. A fox slipping through ruins, a stray horse wandering a broken street, children peeking from basements or shuttered windows. These fleeting encounters carried powerful significance, reminders of continuity beyond the tank, of a world that persisted even as the crew's immediate existence was consumed by machinery, conflict, and survival. The moments evoked longing, melancholy, and sometimes hope, tiny flickers that persisted amidst the relentless grind of war. Maintenance demanded constant attention, a cycle without end. Tracks needed inspection, engines oiling, bolts tightening, and improvised repairs were a daily necessity. Crew members became intimately familiar with every mechanism, anticipating problems before they escalated. The tank, a massive steel entity, was both a protector and a potential threat if neglected. Survival depended on understanding it completely, and the shared responsibility for its upkeep forged bonds of reliance and trust, weaving together skill, intuition, and perseverance into a fabric that kept the men alive. Communication was precise, subtle, and essential. Gestures, eye contact, and clipped words conveyed orders, warnings, and reassurance. The margin for error was minimal. Miscommunication could be catastrophic. Over time, instinct and anticipation became more important than words, and the crew functioned as a single organism within the metal shell. Every movement, every glance, carried significance, and survival demanded constant, synchronized attention, a delicate dance between men and machine. Moments of levity remained precious, brief, and often dark. A whispered joke, sarcastic comment, or a story of improbable luck could break the tension for a heartbeat, reminding the crew of humor, humanity, and camaraderie. These fleeting sparks of joy became essential threads in the daily tapestry of life inside the tank, offering respite, connection, and psychological relief in a world dominated by noise, vibration, and omnipresent danger. The landscape stretched endlessly, a shifting panorama of desolation and muted life. Cratered fields, splintered trees, and half-collapsed villages formed a constant reminder of destruction, yet even in these ravaged spaces, small signs of survival appeared. A bird perched atop a broken wall, a stray dog scavenging along a dirt path, or a distant figure moving cautiously across a field, these glimpses of normality were fleeting yet deeply grounding, reminding the crew that the world beyond the tank continued, even if they themselves were confined to a relentless rhythm of movement, maintenance, and vigilance. Inside, the tank was a microcosm of tension and routine. Metal walls pressed in from all sides, echoing with the groans of machinery, the hiss of hydraulics, and the occasional distant shell. The smell of oil and sweat was omnipresent, mingling with traces of food, tobacco, and mud. Breathing became a skill learned over weeks and months as the crew adapted to the confined, vibrating space. Every sound held meaning, every subtle change in the tank's rhythm could indicate a problem, a shift in terrain, or the arrival of danger. Understanding these nuances was vital, and survival depended on the crew's collective attentiveness. Meals remained ritualized, yet unpredictable. Cans of meat, hard bread, and preserved vegetables were staples, but improvisation was often necessary. Occasionally, a supply delivery brought unexpected treats, or scavenging in abandoned villages yielded fresh vegetables or rare luxuries like chocolate. Preparing and sharing these meals reinforced bonds and offered brief reprieves from the constant stress. Tea, bitter and thin, was cherished. Even a single sip could provide comfort and a momentary sense of normalcy. Conversation, whether about home, memories, or minor complaints, became a subtle form of recreation, a shared human connection amid the mechanical confinement. Hierarchy within the tank structured life but relied heavily on instinct and trust. The commander made strategic decisions, yet execution depended on the synchronized efforts of the driver, gunner, and loader. Orders were communicated with precision, often silently through gestures and eye contact, with every movement carrying weight. Mistakes were costly, sometimes fatal, yet the crew learned to anticipate one another's actions, forming a seamless unit in which instinct and experience bridged gaps that words could not. This unspoken coordination was essential, the backbone of survival in a machine that was both protector and potential executioner. Rumors and stories continued to circulate, blending the real with the impossible. Tales of miraculous survivals, near misses, and strange battlefield occurrences captivated attention, filling long stretches of travel with suspense, humor, and reflection. These narratives, whether factual or embellished, served multiple purposes. They entertained, reinforced camaraderie, and provided psychological scaffolding for men living under constant threat. Even the most outlandish story became part of the shared experience, a mental tool for coping with uncertainty and the ever-present potential for catastrophe. Sleep was stolen in fragments, a delicate balance between rest and vigilance. The cramped tank offered few comfortable positions, forcing men to curl against metal surfaces or each other, blankets mingling with dirt and oil. Dreams intruded unpredictably, often mixing memories, fears, and the surreal imagery of war. Waking required careful attunement. Even a shadow or a sudden sound could trigger an instinctive response. Over time, the crew developed the skill of sleeping while half alert, a resilience shaped by necessity, exhaustion, and the unrelenting demands of life inside a steel coffin that could erupt into chaos at any moment. The terrain outside was both familiar and hostile. Mud, rubble, and craters were constant, yet small acts of resilience from the natural world reminded men of life's persistence. Animals scavenging, plants growing through destruction, and children observing from a distance offered fleeting glimpses of continuity, hope, and humanity beyond the immediate machine-bound existence. These moments were brief, yet profoundly grounding, shaping the crew's perception of a world beyond the immediate threat of survival. Maintenance consumed a significant portion of each day. Tracks had to be checked and adjusted, engines oiled and tuned, bolts inspected and tightened, and minor repairs improvised. The tank was a complex organism demanding constant attention. Neglect could lead to disaster in moments. Crew members became intimately familiar with every aspect of the machinery, anticipating faults, improvising solutions, and developing a shared understanding that was as much instinctual as it was learned. The machine was both lifeline and potential executioner, and survival depended on mastering every nuance. Communication within the tank remained subtle and vital. Gestures, eye contact, and concise words conveyed complex information, often without verbalization. Every action was coordinated, every response precise, and the margin for error was minimal. Over time, the crew functioned as a single organism, reacting almost instinctively to the demands of the environment and the tank itself. The interplay of anticipation, trust, and experience created a rhythm that allowed survival in conditions where small errors could be fatal. Humor persisted in fleeting, treasured moments. A whispered joke, a sarcastic comment, or an absurd story could lift the oppressive weight of tension for even a few seconds. Laughter became a shared language, a fragile but vital thread connecting the crew. It reminded them of humanity, camaraderie, and resilience, providing psychological relief in an environment dominated by noise, vibration, and constant danger. The movement of the tank over uneven terrain became almost hypnotic after long stretches of travel. Mud, rubble, and shattered roads demanded constant focus, yet the monotony allowed the crew's minds to wander, sometimes into memories, sometimes into fears. Every bump and jolt reminded the men that they were suspended between safety and disaster, the line thin and fragile. A hidden ditch could immobilize the machine, a sudden shell could pierce the armor, and yet life inside the tank carried on as though time itself had slowed, compressing endless hours of tension into a rhythm that was both oppressive and strangely familiar. Inside, the tank felt simultaneously protective and claustrophobic. Metal walls, only inches apart, vibrated with the engine, echoing every movement. The smell of sweat, oil, and machinery was ever present, occasionally mingling with faint traces of food or tobacco. Breathing became a practiced skill, as the air inside was rarely clean, and yet each inhale reminded the crew of their tenuous existence. The subtle groans of the machine became a language, signals of strain, warnings, or reassurance, and over time, the men developed a near-intuitive understanding of what each sound meant, a silent dialogue between human and machine. Meals were brief interludes in an otherwise relentless schedule. Canned meat, preserved vegetables, and hard bread were staples, but improvisation was often required. Occasionally, a rare supply delivery or scavenged items brought variety. A few potatoes, a piece of chocolate, or a small tin of fruit became a celebration, however fleeting. Eating together, sharing rations, and sometimes pooling scraps fostered camaraderie, offering a temporary reprieve from the tension that defined every day. Even a sip of bitter tea or the crunch of dry bread carried symbolic weight, anchoring men to the familiarity of sustenance amid chaos. The hierarchy within the tank was clear yet dependent on trust. The commander directed the mission, but success relied on the seamless coordination of the driver, gunner, and loader. Orders were precise, sometimes unspoken, conveyed through gestures, glances, and subtle cues. Mistakes were dangerous, occasionally fatal, yet instinctive understanding grew, allowing the crew to operate as a unit with almost preternatural synchronization. Survival depended on this cohesion, a combination of skill, trust, and shared experience that bound the men together more tightly than any formal structure could. Rumors and stories circulated constantly, a lifeline for attention and morale. Tales of near-impossible survival, miraculous feats, and strange occurrences spread quickly, embellishing reality in ways that entertained, reassured, and sometimes terrified. Even if unverifiable, these stories provided mental scaffolding, giving the crew a framework to process the unpredictable dangers outside. The narrative of shared experience became part of daily life, blending history, imagination, and humor into a collective consciousness that helped men endure the relentless uncertainty. Sleep was fractured and fleeting, stolen in snatches between missions or maintenance. The tank's interior offered little comfort. Men curled against metal, pressed against one another, blankets mingling with dirt and oil. Dreams were often disturbed, reflecting the chaos outside, blending memory, fear, and surreal imagery. Awakening required alertness, as even a minor noise or shadow could trigger an instinctive, potentially life-saving reaction. Over time, the crew adapted, learning to rest while remaining partially alert, developing a resilience unique to their environment. The outside world was both barren and alive. Destroyed villages, cratered fields, and splintered forests dominated the landscape, yet occasional signs of life appeared, animals scavenging, plants growing amidst debris, or children watching cautiously from ruined homes. These fleeting reminders of continuity were grounding, suggesting that life persisted beyond the immediate danger of the tank. The men felt longing and detachment simultaneously, aware of the wider world but confined within steel walls that dictated their existence. Maintenance consumed significant time, yet it was never optional. Tracks required alignment, engines needed oiling, bolts had to be tightened, and improvisation was essential for survival. The crew became intimately familiar with every component, understanding subtle signs of malfunction, anticipating issues, and correcting them before they escalated. The tank was both lifeline and potential executioner, and mastery over its complexities was as essential as tactical skill in combat. Communication within the tank remained subtle but vital. Gestures, eye contact, and concise words conveyed complex information with precision. Each action had weight, and the margin for error was minimal. Over time, instinct, experience, and anticipation allowed the crew to function as a single organism, reacting seamlessly to changing conditions both inside and outside the tank. Survival depended on this synergy, a delicate interplay of trust, skill, and awareness. Moments of humor remained precious. A whispered joke, sarcastic remark, or shared anecdote could momentarily lift the oppressive tension, reminding men of camaraderie, resilience, and humanity. Laughter, brief but genuine, became an invisible thread connecting the crew, a psychological lifeline sustaining them through monotony, fear, and the constant demands of life inside the tank. Even amid mud, debris, and distant shellfire, these small sparks of levity persisted, keeping hope alive in subtle, essential ways. The rhythm of the tank's movement became a constant companion, each vibration, each groan, each subtle shift forming an unspoken cadence that the crew learned to read instinctively. Days blurred into one another, the landscape outside an ever-changing canvas of mud, rubble, and skeletal forests. Roads that had seemed straightforward could suddenly betray the tank, soft earth or hidden craters forcing abrupt maneuvers, while distant hills and shattered villages offered both potential cover and the risk of ambush. Every meter traveled demanded focus, anticipation, and seamless coordination among the men, for even a momentary lapse could mean disaster. Inside, the tank was suffocating yet oddly protective, a mechanical womb of survival. Metal walls pressed close, resonating with the engine's deep hum, the occasional clank of shifting gears, and the subtle vibrations of overworked tracks. The air was thick with the scent of oil, sweat, and machinery, occasionally punctuated by the faint aroma of preserved food or tobacco. Breathing became an almost conscious act, as every inhalation reminded the crew of both life and the fragile boundary between safety and catastrophe. The machine itself seemed alive, communicating in its vibrations and sounds, a language the men came to understand with near-instinctive precision. Meals offered a brief respite from tension, though monotony dictated their composition. Canned meat, hard bread, and preserved vegetables formed the staples, while scavenged ingredients or rare supply drops brought temporary reprieve. Sharing these small portions became a ritual, reinforcing camaraderie and offering moments of normalcy. Even a bitter cup of tea or a piece of chocolate carried disproportionate comfort, grounding the men in human experience amidst the relentless demands of machinery and war. Conversation often revolved around memories, minor disputes, or whimsical imaginings, providing distraction and mental relief. Hierarchy was strict yet intertwined with necessity and mutual trust. The commander dictated strategy, but execution relied on flawless synchronization. The driver felt each nuance of terrain, the gunner tracked targets with meticulous attention, and the loader managed ammunition with precision honed over countless engagements. Communication relied heavily on brevity. Gestures, glances, and concise commands replaced lengthy explanations. Mistakes were costly, yet through experience, anticipation, and mutual understanding, the crew developed a seamless operational rhythm, moving as a single, highly attuned organism. Rumors and stories persisted, providing both entertainment and a framework to process the unpredictable. Tales of miraculous survival, improbable feats, or unexplained events circulated quickly, blending reality with imagination. Even the most fantastical anecdotes served a purpose, distracting from tension, reinforcing bonds, and providing mental scaffolding. The shared narratives shaped perceptions of the outside world, offering context, humor, and a way to endure uncertainty that was otherwise relentless. Sleep was rare, always precarious, stolen in small intervals. The cramped tank offered few comfortable positions, requiring men to curl against metal or each other, blankets mingling with grime and sweat. Dreams intruded unbidden, often reflecting the chaos outside or warping into surreal, disorienting visions. Waking demanded heightened awareness, for even minor sounds or shadows could trigger instinctive reactions crucial for survival. Over time, the crew adapted, learning to rest while maintaining vigilance, cultivating a resilience forged by fatigue, experience, and necessity. The outside world alternated between devastation and quiet signs of life. Cratered fields, shattered forests, and destroyed villages dominated the landscape, yet subtle reminders of persistence appeared unexpectedly. Birds perched atop ruins, animals scavenging through debris, or distant figures moving cautiously across open spaces. These fleeting encounters were grounding, offering perspective on life beyond the tank, evoking longing, reflection, and a sense of fragile hope in the persistence of the ordinary amid destruction. Maintenance consumed the majority of idle hours, a task both critical and constant. Tracks required alignment, engines demanded oil and care, bolts needed tightening, and minor mechanical faults had to be addressed before escalation. The crew's intimate knowledge of the tank grew with experience, a mix of instinct, learned skill, and improvisation. The vehicle was simultaneously protector and potential threat. Mastery over its nuances was essential for survival. Communication remained subtle yet essential. Gestures, glances, and clipped words conveyed complex information, guiding action with precision. The crew functioned as a single entity, anticipating one another's moves, reacting almost instinctively to the tank's needs and environmental cues. Every motion carried weight. Every delay or misstep could be catastrophic. Trust, coordination, and experience were indispensable, forming an invisible network of interdependence that kept men alive in circumstances that were otherwise merciless. Humor, though fleeting, persisted as a vital survival tool. A whispered joke, playful insult, or absurd anecdote could briefly dissolve tension, fostering connection and camaraderie. Laughter, rare yet profound, reminded men of humanity, resilience, and the fragile joy that persisted even amidst mud, machinery, and constant danger. These small bursts of levity sustained morale, reinforcing bonds and offering psychological relief in a world otherwise defined by monotony, fear, and the relentless demands of life inside the tank. The horizon stretched endlessly, a muted expanse of craters, ruined villages, and skeletal trees that bore witness to the relentless march of war. Even when the sky seemed calm, danger lingered in every shadow, every fold of terrain. Hidden ditches, soft patches of mud, and concealed artillery positions demanded constant vigilance. Each meter traveled required instinctive judgment, rapid coordination, and a shared understanding between men who had long since learned that hesitation could mean disaster. The rhythm of the tank became both a lifeline and a mental anchor, a continuous hum against which the crew measured time, fear, and endurance. Inside, the tank was an ecosystem of its own, claustrophobic and alive. Metal walls reverberated with the engine's deep thrum, the hiss of hydraulics, and the occasional metallic groan. The smell of oil, sweat, and machinery was omnipresent, punctuated by faint traces of preserved food or tobacco. Each inhalation reinforced awareness, a reminder of the fragile boundary between survival and catastrophe. The tank communicated in subtle ways, vibrations, sounds, and minor shifts that the crew learned to interpret instinctively. Understanding this silent language became a matter of life and death, blending intuition, experience, and acute observation. Food remained a small but crucial part of life. Cans of meat, hard bread, and preserved vegetables dominated, yet improvisation was constant. Scavenged fruits, rare supply drops, or even unexpected scraps became celebrated events, offering comfort and temporary reprieve from monotony. Meals were shared with care, each bite a moment of connection, a brief return to humanity amidst steel, dirt, and tension. Tea, bitter and thin, was savored as a luxury, even the smallest taste grounded men to ordinary experience, reinforcing camaraderie in a world defined by unpredictability and fear. Hierarchy within the tank was rigid yet intertwined with mutual dependence. The commander made tactical decisions, but flawless execution relied on the driver, gunner, and loader operating in perfect synchrony. Commands were concise, often nonverbal, relying on gestures, glances, and subtle cues. Mistakes were dangerous, yet through repetition, anticipation, and shared understanding, the crew operated as a single unit, moving in a near-instinctive rhythm where each member's skill and awareness were indispensable. Rumors and stories were lifelines, filling idle moments and providing psychological scaffolding. Tales of near-impossible survival, legendary feats, and strange battlefield occurrences circulated quickly. Even fantastical anecdotes offered comfort, distraction, and bonding opportunities. These narratives, whether rooted in reality or imagination, became part of the crew's mental landscape, shaping perceptions of danger, reinforcing trust, and offering relief from the relentless monotony and tension of life inside a tank. Sleep was fragile and fragmented. The cramped interior forced awkward positions, bodies pressed against metal or each other, blankets entwined with grime. Dreams intruded unpredictably, often reflecting the chaos outside or transforming reality into surreal imagery. Waking demanded alertness. Every sound or shadow could trigger an instinctive reaction vital for survival. Over time, the crew developed the skill of resting while partially alert, a resilience forged through repeated exposure to stress, fatigue, and constant threat. The world outside alternated between ruin and quiet persistence. Cratered fields, shattered forests, and bombed villages dominated the landscape, yet animals scavenged, plants sprouted through rubble, and distant figures moved cautiously through destruction. These fleeting glimpses of life offered perspective, grounding the crew, and reminding them of the humanity that endured beyond steel walls. Such moments evoked longing, melancholy, and fragile hope, a subtle counterpoint to the omnipresent danger of the battlefield. Maintenance was ceaseless and essential. Tracks required alignment, engines oiling, bolts tightening, and mechanical faults improvised or repaired on the spot. The crew's intimate knowledge of the tank became vital, understanding nuances that could mean the difference between life and death. The machine was at once protector and potential executioner. Mastery over it was inseparable from survival, forging a bond of dependency, respect, and expertise that defined daily life. Communication remained subtle yet indispensable. Gestures, eye contact, and brief words conveyed complex information with clarity. The crew operated as a single organism, anticipating movements, responding instantly to shifts in the tank or environment, and maintaining cohesion under stress. Each action carried weight, and even minor missteps could have catastrophic consequences. Trust, skill, and intuition intertwined to form a system that allowed survival where ordinary coordination would fail. Humor, though rare, was vital. A whispered joke, sarcastic remark, or shared anecdote could briefly lift the oppressive weight of tension. Laughter, fleeting and fragile, became a binding thread, reinforcing camaraderie and reminding the men of their shared humanity. Even amid mud, vibration, and the constant hum of danger, these sparks of levity persisted, sustaining morale and offering a psychological counterpoint to the unrelenting demands of life inside the tank. The tank rolled forward, its massive tracks chewing through mud and debris, carrying men whose thoughts were as much on survival as on the invisible line between yesterday and tomorrow. Time inside moved differently, stretched by monotony and compressed by sudden jolts or threats that could erupt without warning. Each vibration, each metallic groan, became a signal, a message that required instant interpretation. The crew developed a sensitivity that outsiders could never grasp, an almost sixth sense honed by weeks of immersion in the confines of steel, oil, and danger. The machine was alive in their perception, a partner demanding both attention and respect, a constant presence whose failures could spell disaster in seconds. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, a mixture of sweat, oil, metal, and the occasional faint aroma of preserved food or tobacco. Breathing became an almost meditative practice, a conscious reminder of being alive yet under constant threat. Even mundane tasks, adjusting a seat, shifting a gear, checking a hatch, required awareness, because the line between normal operation and catastrophe was razor-thin. Every sound, every vibration, every subtle movement carried meaning, a language the crew learned to read instinctively, with no margin for error. Meals were not merely sustenance. They were brief sanctuaries of normality. Canned meat, hard bread, and dried vegetables formed the standard fare, yet ingenuity often transformed monotony into novelty. Scavenged vegetables or rare supply drops could elevate a meager meal into something resembling comfort. Tea, bitter and thin, was savored for warmth and familiarity, a ritual that offered both physical relief and psychological grounding. Conversation during meals became a necessary distraction, a chance to connect, to joke, or to share memories, reinforcing bonds that were as vital as ammunition in the loader's hands. The hierarchy within the tank was rigid yet flexible, structured but dependent on mutual trust. The commander set objectives, but the precise execution relied on flawless coordination among driver, gunner, and loader. Commands were often unspoken, conveyed through subtle gestures, glances, or the timing of a movement. Mistakes could be catastrophic, yet through repetition, anticipation, and understanding, the crew operated as a cohesive organism. This synergy became a lifeline, the invisible thread that held life and machine together against the chaos of war. Rumors and stories persisted, filling gaps between action and waiting, blending reality with imagination. Tales of near-miraculous survival, improbable heroism, or strange battlefield occurrences traveled quickly, becoming part of the shared mental landscape. They entertained, reassured, and bonded, giving structure to the unpredictable and offering psychological scaffolding. Even the most outlandish story provided meaning, offering subtle instruction or caution disguised as humor or legend. Sleep was precarious, stolen in fragments, each moment a delicate balance of rest and vigilance. Cramped positions forced men to curl against metal or one another, blankets intermingling with grime and oil. Dreams often reflected chaos, morphing memories and fears into surreal sequences that lingered even after waking. Awakening required heightened alertness, for a shadow or a distant sound could demand an immediate response. Over time, the crew developed resilience, learning to rest without ever fully surrendering their guard, mastering the delicate art of vigilance while asleep. The outside world was alternately devastating and persistently alive. Cratered fields, splintered forests, and bombed villages bore witness to destruction, yet small signs of life persisted. Animals scavenged, plants pushed through debris, and distant figures observed cautiously from a safe distance. These brief glimpses of continuity provided perspective and grounding, reminding the crew that life endured beyond the immediate machinery-bound existence. Longing and detachment intertwined, as men recognized the persistence of the world while remaining confined to a relentless routine of vigilance, maintenance, and survival. Maintenance demanded constant attention, an unending cycle of inspection, repair, and improvisation. Tracks needed alignment, engines required oiling, bolts had to be tightened, and minor mechanical faults needed immediate correction. Familiarity with the tank became a survival skill, a mix of learned expertise and instinct. The machine was both protector and potential executioner. Understanding its quirks and vulnerabilities was inseparable from living another day. Communication remained subtle, precise, and vital. Gestures, glances, and concise words carried essential information, ensuring the crew functioned as a single organism. Every action had consequences. Missteps could be fatal. The trust, anticipation, and experience that developed over time formed a network of interdependence, allowing men to survive where ordinary coordination would fail. Humor, though scarce, persisted as an essential survival tool. A whispered joke, a sarcastic quip, or a shared anecdote could temporarily relieve the oppressive weight of monotony and danger. Laughter became a fragile yet crucial thread, reinforcing camaraderie, reminding the men of humanity, and offering psychological sustenance in a world dominated by machinery, mud, and the ceaseless hum of survival. The tank trudged forward, groaning over broken roads and churned-up fields, each turn and jolt a reminder that safety was always temporary. The landscape outside seemed endless, a patchwork of devastation punctuated by fleeting signs of life. A fox darting across a cratered field, the silhouette of a horse wandering through rubble, or the cautious gaze of children peering from the remains of a village. These glimpses of normality were rare, yet they anchored the crew to a world beyond the steel walls, a world that seemed distant yet stubbornly persistent. The rhythm of travel was relentless, demanding constant awareness, and yet, within the monotony, small moments of observation, reflection, or even wonder crept in, providing mental respite amid fatigue. Inside, the tank was a claustrophobic ecosystem of sensation and routine. Metal walls pressed close, echoing with the engine's low thrum, the hiss of hydraulics, and the subtle clank of shifting gears. The air was thick, a mixture of sweat, oil, and dust, occasionally pierced by the faint aroma of food or tobacco. Each breath was both necessary and conscious, a reminder of life under constraint. The tank itself communicated through vibration and sound, a language the men learned to interpret instinctively. Every groan, shake, and subtle shift could signal danger or a mechanical issue, making constant attention imperative. Food was a small but vital anchor to normality. Standard rations of canned meat, hard bread, and preserved vegetables formed the base of sustenance, yet ingenuity often turned these meager provisions into something more bearable. Scavenged vegetables or rare supply drops brought rare excitement, creating moments of temporary comfort. Tea, bitter and thin, was cherished as a ritual, a brief warmth and familiarity that grounded men in human experience. Meals were shared with deliberate care, conversations fleeting yet significant, reinforcing bonds and offering distraction from constant stress. Hierarchy within the tank was rigid in theory but flexible in practice, a balance maintained through trust and experience. The commander made strategic decisions, yet flawless execution depended on the seamless coordination of driver, gunner, and loader. Commands were often nonverbal, transmitted through gestures, glances, or timing. Mistakes were dangerous, but the crews developed intuition and mutual understanding allowed them to operate almost as a single organism. This cohesion was essential for survival, forming a rhythm that kept life and machine synchronized under extreme conditions. Stories and rumors flourished within these confined walls, shaping perceptions and sustaining morale. Tales of near-miraculous survival, improbable feats, and unexplained battlefield occurrences circulated quickly. Whether fact or exaggeration, these narratives offered mental scaffolding, entertainment, and subtle instruction. They helped men contextualize chaos, prepare psychologically for dangers, and bond over shared experience. In a world dominated by unpredictability, these stories became as essential as ammunition or mechanical skill, a mental reservoir for endurance. Sleep was elusive, fractured by necessity and discomfort. The cramped interior forced men into awkward positions, pressed against metal or one another, blankets intermingled with grime. Dreams intruded unpredictably, often mirroring chaos outside or morphing memories into surreal imagery. Waking required acute awareness, for a shadow, sound, or vibration could demand immediate action. Over time, the crew learned to rest while remaining partly alert, developing a resilience and adaptability forged under constant exposure to danger, fatigue, and confinement. The terrain outside alternated between stark devastation and subtle signs of life. Cratered fields, destroyed buildings, and scarred forests bore witness to relentless conflict. Yet flora and fauna persisted. Animals scavenged, plants pushed through debris, and distant figures observed cautiously. These fleeting signs of persistence provided grounding, perspective, and a faint reminder of humanity beyond the immediate exigencies of war. Longing and detachment coexisted, the crew aware of life beyond yet confined to the steel cocoon of survival. Maintenance was relentless. Tracks required alignment, engines oiling, bolts tightening, and minor mechanical failures corrected with improvisation. The crew's intimate knowledge of the tank grew with necessity, blending skill, instinct, and ingenuity. The vehicle was simultaneously protector and potential threat. Mastery over its operation was inseparable from survival, an ongoing partnership of trust and expertise. Communication remained subtle but indispensable. Gestures, glances, and brief words conveyed crucial information, allowing the crew to operate as a single, cohesive entity. Every action had consequence. Even minor missteps could prove fatal. Trust, anticipation, and shared experience wove together a network of interdependence that enabled men to navigate peril and maintain cohesion under constant strain. Humor persisted as a fragile but essential survival tool. A whispered joke, sarcastic remark, or shared anecdote could temporarily lift tension, forging connection and reinforcing camaraderie. Laughter, brief and fragile, was more than amusement. It was resilience, a reminder of shared humanity and psychological sustenance amidst mud, machinery, and perpetual vigilance. The tank creaked and groaned as it advanced over broken terrain, each movement a test of patience, skill, and attention. Craters gaped like scars across the fields, twisted metal and rubble littered the roads, and shattered villages bore silent witness to the relentlessness of war. Yet even amid this devastation, small signs of persistence appeared. A bird darting between ruins, a stray animal scavenging the remains of a destroyed farmhouse, or the distant, cautious movements of civilians attempting to reclaim fragments of daily life. These fleeting glimpses reminded the crew of the world beyond the steel walls, a world that persisted stubbornly, indifferent to the mechanized violence that carved its scars so deeply into the earth. Inside, the tank was both sanctuary and prison. The metal walls enclosed a small, vibrating ecosystem, alive with the hum of engines, the hiss of hydraulics, and the subtle clank of shifting gears. The air was thick with sweat, oil, and dust, mingling with the occasional aroma of tea or a rare piece of chocolate. Every breath was conscious, a reminder of life under confinement, each inhalation carrying the awareness that danger lurked beyond every hatch and horizon. The tank itself spoke in vibrations and sounds, a language the crew learned to interpret instinctively. Each groan or shudder could indicate a mechanical issue, an approaching obstacle, or an imminent threat, and understanding these cues was essential for survival. Meals offered a temporary reprieve from the relentless tension. Standard rations of canned meat, hard bread, and preserved vegetables were supplemented when possible by scavenged items or rare supply drops. Even a few potatoes, a fragment of chocolate, or a thin slice of dried fruit became a small victory, a reminder of normalcy in a world dominated by metal, mud, and noise. Tea, though bitter and thin, was cherished for warmth and ritual. Shared meals were opportunities to converse, to bond, and to briefly forget the omnipresent threat, fostering cohesion and sustaining morale in subtle but vital ways. Hierarchy in the tank was clear but depended on trust and skill. The commander set objectives, but the execution relied entirely on the synchronized efforts of the driver, gunner, and loader. Orders were often communicated through gestures, glances, or timing rather than words. Mistakes could be fatal, yet through repetition and mutual understanding, the crew functioned almost instinctively, a single organism responding to the shifting demands of terrain, machinery, and combat. This cohesion was a lifeline, an invisible framework that balanced human intuition and mechanical necessity. Stories and rumors flourished within these confined quarters. Tales of narrow escapes, miraculous survival, and absurd or inexplicable battlefield occurrences circulated rapidly, blending truth and exaggeration. These narratives entertained, reassured, and bonded, providing psychological scaffolding in a world defined by unpredictability. Even implausible stories served a purpose: distraction, instruction, or subtle preparation for dangers that could not be anticipated. The crew relied on them as much as on maps or instruments, a mental toolkit for navigating uncertainty. Sleep remained fragmented and precarious. Cramped positions forced men to curl against metal or one another, blankets entwined with grime and oil. Dreams were intrusive, often echoing the chaos outside or transforming memories into distorted visions. Waking demanded alertness, for any sound or shadow could require immediate action. Over time, the crew developed a skill for partial rest, learning to maintain awareness while recuperating, cultivating resilience in the delicate balance between fatigue and readiness. Outside, the landscape alternated between devastation and subtle signs of life. Bombed-out villages, cratered fields, and splintered forests were countered by scavenging animals, persistent vegetation, and distant observers cautiously reclaiming their surroundings. These glimpses offered grounding, perspective, and a reminder that life endured, however fragile, beyond the confines of the tank. Longing and detachment intertwined. The crew saw what existed beyond, yet remained confined, bound to machinery, survival, and routine. Maintenance demanded constant attention. Tracks needed alignment, engines required oiling, bolts had to be checked, and mechanical issues improvised or repaired. The crew's intimate understanding of the tank became a form of survival literacy, blending skill, instinct, and improvisation. The tank was simultaneously protector and threat. Mastery over its operation was inseparable from the continuation of life. Communication remained subtle but vital. Gestures, glances, and brief verbal cues conveyed complex information, allowing the crew to function as a cohesive unit. Each action carried consequence. A misstep could be deadly. Trust, coordination, and intuition intertwined, forming a network that enabled men to respond instantly and effectively to any situation, maintaining survival in a hostile environment. Humor persisted as a fragile yet essential thread. A whispered joke, sarcastic comment, or shared anecdote could briefly lift the oppressive weight of tension, reinforcing camaraderie and sustaining psychological endurance. Laughter, though fleeting, reminded the crew of humanity, resilience, and life beyond metal and mud, serving as a small but indispensable counterbalance to the unrelenting demands of tank warfare. The tank pressed on, rumbling through the fractured terrain, each rotation of the tracks carrying the crew deeper into uncertainty. Craters, splintered trees, and ruined villages formed an endless maze of obstacles and potential ambushes. The horizon shifted constantly, offering glimpses of life surviving amid destruction. A solitary fox darting between ruins, a horse cautiously navigating debris, or the distant movement of civilians attempting to reclaim fragments of normality. These moments, fleeting and fragile, reminded the men of the world beyond steel and mud, a world that persisted stubbornly, indifferent to the mechanized violence that scarred the land. Inside, the tank remained both confining and protective, a small ecosystem vibrating with the pulse of engines, hydraulics, and moving parts. The air was heavy, thick with oil, sweat, and dust, occasionally touched by the aroma of tea, chocolate, or the rare treat that found its way into rations. Breathing was deliberate, conscious, a subtle affirmation of life in the midst of perpetual stress. The tank communicated in its own language of vibrations, metallic groans, and subtle movements, each signal requiring immediate recognition and understanding. The men developed a near-instinctive attunement, reading the nuances of the machine as though it were a living companion, knowing that survival depended on precision, awareness, and mutual respect between crew and steel. Meals provided temporary relief from the unrelenting routine. Standard rations of canned meat, hard bread, and preserved vegetables were supplemented whenever opportunity allowed, turning meager supplies into brief celebrations. Even a handful of scavenged potatoes or a scrap of chocolate became moments of triumph. Tea, bitter and thin, became a ritual, grounding the crew in shared habits and offering a faint comfort amid monotony. Conversations during meals ranged from fleeting jokes to reflections on home, war, and life, strengthening bonds and sustaining morale in subtle, indispensable ways. Hierarchy remained defined yet dynamic. The commander issued directives, but the success of any maneuver relied on flawless coordination among the driver, gunner, and loader. Orders often transcended words, transmitted through subtle glances, gestures, and timing, a silent choreography of motion and anticipation. Errors were dangerous, sometimes fatal, but experience, repetition, and trust allowed the crew to operate as a single, cohesive entity. This synchronization was a lifeline, a delicate equilibrium of human skill, mechanical demands, and environmental awareness. Stories and rumors flowed incessantly, coloring the long hours between action and travel. Tales of narrow escapes, miraculous survivals, and absurd or unexplained incidents circulated quickly, blending fact with embellishment. These narratives entertained, reassured, and provided psychological scaffolding, helping men navigate uncertainty and chaos. Even improbable stories served practical purposes: instruction through analogy, preparation for dangers, or simple relief from monotony. In a world defined by unpredictability, storytelling became a vital survival tool. Sleep was a scarce and fragile commodity. The cramped tank forced men into contorted positions, pressed against metal or each other, blankets mingling with grime and oil. Dreams intruded without warning, often transforming memory and fear into surreal sequences. Awakening required alertness, for a shadow, a sudden noise, or a shift in vibration could demand immediate action. Over time, the crew mastered the art of partial rest, cultivating a resilience born from fatigue, experience, and the necessity of constant vigilance. Outside, the world alternated between stark devastation and tenacious signs of life. Bombed-out villages, cratered fields, and scarred forests bore witness to war, yet scavenging animals, sprouting plants, and distant human activity persisted. These glimpses offered grounding, a reminder of life beyond the tank, evoking longing and melancholy while underscoring the crew's confinement to machinery, routine, and survival. Maintenance demanded constant attention and vigilance. Tracks required alignment, engines oiling, bolts tightening, and minor mechanical faults improvised or repaired immediately. Familiarity with the tank became a form of survival literacy, blending learned skill, instinct, and improvisation. The vehicle was simultaneously protector and threat. Understanding its quirks and vulnerabilities was inseparable from living another day. Communication inside the tank was subtle, precise, and vital. Gestures, glances, and brief words carried essential information, allowing the crew to act as a unified organism. Every motion had consequence, and even minor errors could be fatal. Trust, coordination, and intuition intertwined, forming a network that enabled men to respond instantly and maintain cohesion in a hostile environment. Humor remained a fragile yet indispensable lifeline. A whispered joke, sarcastic comment, or shared anecdote could briefly relieve tension, reinforcing camaraderie and reminding men of their humanity. Laughter, though fleeting, sustained morale, providing psychological sustenance in a world dominated by machinery, mud, and the relentless hum of survival. The tank trudged onward, its heavy tracks grinding against the churned earth, carrying the crew through landscapes marred by war yet stubbornly alive in small, unexpected ways. Pocked fields, ruined roads, and shattered villages stretched in every direction, and amid this desolation, tiny signs of persistence caught the eye: a bird perched on a splintered roof, a fox slinking between craters, or a distant figure moving cautiously across an abandoned farm. These fleeting moments reminded the men that life continued beyond the steel confines of their machine, a reality that seemed simultaneously distant and hauntingly near. Inside, the tank felt simultaneously oppressive and protective. The metal walls reverberated with the deep hum of engines, the hiss of hydraulics, and the occasional metallic creak as the machine shifted over uneven terrain. The air was thick with the mingled scents of sweat, oil, dust, and the occasional waft of tea or preserved food. Breathing became a deliberate act, a conscious reminder of life in a space that offered both refuge and danger. The tank communicated through subtle vibrations and sounds, each groan or shudder a signal to be interpreted, an urgent message that could dictate the crew's next action or even save a life. Meals were a brief oasis of normalcy. Standard rations, canned meat, hard bread, and dried vegetables dominated sustenance, yet ingenuity often transformed monotony into small pleasures. Scavenged vegetables, a rare piece of chocolate, or a few potatoes from an abandoned cellar became moments of celebration, fleeting victories over the harshness of the environment. Tea, bitter and thin, was savored for its ritual and warmth, a grounding element amidst the relentless motion and noise. Conversations during these breaks ranged from jokes to memories of home, binding the men together in ways as essential as any mechanical repair. Hierarchy within the tank was clear but relied on trust, skill, and mutual reliance. The commander set objectives, yet flawless execution depended on the seamless interplay of driver, gunner, and loader. Commands were often nonverbal, gestures, glances, subtle timing, requiring each man to anticipate the other's actions instinctively. Errors carried high stakes, yet over time, experience and understanding forged a rhythm that allowed the crew to function as a single organism, balancing human skill with mechanical precision. Stories and rumors filled idle hours, blending truth and exaggeration into a shared mental landscape. Tales of improbable survival, audacious feats, and strange battlefield phenomena circulated rapidly, providing entertainment, psychological relief, and subtle instruction. Even the most fantastical anecdotes offered coping strategies, mental rehearsal for danger, or simply distraction from monotony. These narratives became as crucial to survival as ammunition or engine maintenance, weaving a framework of shared understanding that helped the crew navigate uncertainty. Sleep was scarce and fraught. Cramped positions forced men to curl against metal or each other, blankets entwined with grime and sweat. Dreams intruded unpredictably, echoing chaos, fear, and memory in surreal ways. Waking demanded instant readiness. A shadow, distant sound, or vibration could require immediate reaction. Over time, the crew adapted, mastering the delicate balance of partial rest, cultivating resilience born of necessity, exhaustion, and constant vigilance. The world beyond the tank alternated between devastation and subtle persistence. Cratered fields, bombed villages, and scarred forests bore witness to destruction, yet scavenging animals, sprouting plants, and cautious human activity persisted. These glimpses grounded the crew, providing perspective and reminders of life beyond metal and machinery. Longing and detachment coexisted. The men were aware of what existed beyond their confined world, yet bound to routine, survival, and the demands of their machine. Maintenance was relentless. Tracks required alignment, engines oiling, bolts tightening, and minor mechanical issues improvised on the spot. Intimate knowledge of the tank became indispensable, blending skill, instinct, and resourcefulness. The vehicle was both protector and threat. Mastery over its functions was inseparable from life itself. Communication remained subtle yet vital. Gestures, glances, and clipped words conveyed essential information, allowing the crew to operate as a single, coordinated unit. Every action carried weight, and even minor mistakes could be fatal. Trust, intuition, and experience intertwined, forming a network that enabled the men to respond instantly and effectively to evolving situations. Humor persisted, fragile but necessary. A whispered joke, sarcastic remark, or shared anecdote could lift tension briefly, reinforcing camaraderie and sustaining morale. Laughter, though fleeting, reminded the men of their humanity and resilience, offering psychological relief in a world dominated by vibration, machinery, and uncertainty. The tank continued its slow, grinding journey across the scarred landscape, each rotation of its tracks a steady, insistent rhythm against the churned earth. Craters yawned like open wounds, twisted metal littered the roads, and shattered villages bore silent testimony to relentless conflict. Yet amid this desolation, small signs of life appeared unexpectedly. A bird hopping across rubble, a fox slinking between debris, or a distant figure cautiously crossing a ruined field. These fleeting moments reminded the men of a world beyond the steel confines of their machine, a world that existed stubbornly despite the scars of war. Observing these signs offered brief mental escape, a connection to something larger than mud, steel, and machinery. Inside, the tank was both protective cocoon and claustrophobic prison. Metal walls reverberated with the hum of engines, the hiss of hydraulics, and the occasional metallic groan as the tank shifted over rough terrain. Air was thick, a mixture of oil, sweat, dust, and the occasional faint aroma of tea or preserved food. Each breath carried awareness, a subtle reminder that survival depended on attentiveness and instinct. The tank itself seemed to speak through vibrations and sounds, groans, shudders, and subtle shifts conveying crucial information about terrain, mechanical strain, or potential danger. The crew learned to read this silent language, developing an almost instinctive understanding that could mean the difference between life and death. Meals were fleeting oases of normalcy, a chance to nourish both body and mind. Canned meat, hard bread, and preserved vegetables formed the baseline, yet ingenuity often transformed rations into temporary comfort. A few scavenged potatoes, a scrap of chocolate, or a small tin of fruit became celebratory tokens, moments to break the monotony of constant motion. Tea, thin and bitter, was a ritual, providing warmth, structure, and a fleeting sense of familiarity. Conversation during these moments ranged from jokes to stories of home, binding the men together and reinforcing camaraderie that was as essential as any mechanical repair or tactical maneuver. The hierarchy inside the tank was strict yet flexible, relying on trust and skill. The commander issued directives, but successful execution depended on the flawless interplay of driver, gunner, and loader. Commands often transcended words, relying on subtle glances, gestures, and timing, a silent choreography developed through shared experience. Mistakes were perilous, yet repeated exposure, anticipation, and mutual understanding allowed the crew to function almost as a single organism, blending human intuition with mechanical precision. Stories and rumors circulated constantly, shaping perception and sustaining morale. Tales of improbable survival, daring exploits, and strange battlefield events spread quickly, weaving a shared mental landscape that entertained and reassured. Even exaggerated or fantastical accounts served practical purposes. Cautionary examples, mental rehearsal for danger, or simply diversion from monotony. These narratives became vital psychological tools, helping men navigate unpredictability while reinforcing shared experience and trust. Sleep was scarce and precarious, a fragile reprieve from unrelenting tension. Cramped positions forced men to curl against metal or each other, blankets entwined with grime and oil. Dreams were vivid and intrusive, often reflecting external chaos or distorting memory into surreal sequences. Awakening required alertness, for even minor sounds, shadows, or vibrations could demand instant response. The crew learned to rest without surrendering vigilance, cultivating resilience through repeated exposure to danger, fatigue, and confined living. Beyond the tank, the world alternated between ruin and persistence. Bombed villages, cratered fields, and splintered forests coexisted with scavenging animals, persistent plants, and cautious human activity. These glimpses of life provided grounding, perspective, and fleeting hope, even as longing and detachment intertwined. The men recognized the world beyond their steel confines yet remained bound to routine, machinery, and survival. Maintenance was an unending necessity. Tracks required constant alignment, engines demanded oiling, bolts tightening, and mechanical issues were repaired or improvised on the spot. The crew's intimate knowledge of the tank became a lifeline, blending skill, intuition, and resourcefulness. The machine was both protector and threat. Mastery over its intricacies was inseparable from survival. Communication was subtle, precise, and vital. Gestures, glances, and brief words conveyed critical information, allowing the crew to operate as a cohesive unit. Every motion had consequence, and minor mistakes could prove fatal. Trust, coordination, and intuition intertwined, creating a network of interdependence essential for effective response under constant threat. Humor persisted as a delicate but necessary thread. A whispered joke, sarcastic remark, or shared anecdote could briefly dissolve tension, reinforcing camaraderie and psychological endurance. Laughter, fleeting yet significant, reminded men of their humanity, resilience, and life beyond mud, metal, and the ceaseless hum of survival. The tank rumbled forward, each turn of its massive tracks sending vibrations through the hull, a relentless cadence that both comforted and exhausted the crew. The terrain outside was a mixture of ruin and stubborn life. Fields pockmarked with craters, forests stripped to skeletal trunks, and villages reduced to jagged outlines of walls and roofs. Yet in this desolation, small signs of persistence appeared, birds flitting between debris, foxes cautiously scavenging, or the distant movement of people reclaiming fragments of daily life. Each sight was a reminder that the world beyond the tank persisted, indifferent yet undeniably alive, offering a fleeting connection to normalcy in a life dominated by metal, mud, and vigilance. Inside, the tank remained a confined ecosystem, a blend of machine, human presence, and tension. Metal walls reverberated with the deep hum of engines, the hiss of hydraulics, and occasional metallic groans as the tank shifted over uneven ground. The air was dense with the mingled scents of oil, sweat, and dust, punctuated sometimes by the faint aroma of tea, chocolate, or preserved food. Each breath became a conscious act, a subtle affirmation of life under continuous pressure. The tank communicated in vibrations, subtle shifts, and sounds that the crew had learned to interpret with near-instinctive precision. A sudden shudder, a groan from the engine, or the rasp of a track could mean a mechanical fault, an approaching hazard, or the immediate need for action. Attention to these signals was crucial. Meals were more than nutrition. They were moments of respite and psychological restoration. Canned meat, hard bread, and dried vegetables were standard, but resourcefulness transformed them into temporary relief. A few scavenged potatoes, a rare piece of chocolate, or a tin of preserved fruit could briefly lift spirits. Tea, bitter and thin, became a ritual, offering warmth, structure, and a fleeting sense of comfort. Conversations during these meals ranged from jokes to reminiscences, binding the crew together and reinforcing cohesion that was as vital as any mechanical repair or tactical maneuver. Hierarchy inside the tank was clear but required trust, skill, and anticipation. The commander directed maneuvers, but success depended entirely on flawless coordination among driver, gunner, and loader. Commands often transcended words, communicated through subtle gestures, glances, or timing, a silent choreography refined through shared experience. Mistakes carried high stakes, yet familiarity, trust, and anticipation allowed the crew to function almost as a single organism, blending intuition with mechanical precision. Stories and rumors passed quickly within the confines of the tank, shaping perception and sustaining morale. Tales of miraculous survival, daring exploits, and inexplicable incidents were recounted, each blending truth and exaggeration. Even the most fantastical stories provided practical benefits, cautionary lessons, psychological preparation, or mere distraction from monotony. Storytelling became an essential survival tool, a shared mental framework that helped the crew navigate uncertainty while reinforcing trust and cohesion. Sleep was both rare and precarious. The confined space forced men into awkward positions, curled against metal or each other, blankets mingled with sweat and grime. Dreams intruded unpredictably, reflecting external chaos or distorting memory into surreal sequences. Awakening required constant vigilance. Even minor noises or vibrations could demand immediate response. Over time, the crew developed the skill of partial rest, cultivating resilience born from necessity, fatigue, and the omnipresent threat of danger. Beyond the tank, the world fluctuated between devastation and persistence. Bombed villages, cratered fields, and splintered forests coexisted with animals scavenging, vegetation pushing through debris, and distant humans reclaiming fragments of everyday life. These glimpses offered grounding and perspective, evoking longing while reinforcing awareness of confinement to routine, machinery, and survival. Maintenance was constant, unending, and vital. Tracks required alignment, engines needed oiling, bolts tightening, and minor mechanical issues demanded improvisation and skill. Intimate knowledge of the tank became indispensable, merging learned expertise, instinct, and adaptability. The machine was both protector and threat. Mastery of its operation was inseparable from survival. Communication remained subtle yet crucial. Gestures, brief words, and glances conveyed essential information, enabling the crew to function as a cohesive unit. Every action carried consequence. Even minor errors could prove fatal. Trust, coordination, and anticipation created a network of interdependence, allowing rapid, effective responses under pressure. Humor, though fleeting, remained vital. A whispered joke, sarcastic comment, or shared anecdote could temporarily relieve tension, reinforcing camaraderie and providing psychological resilience. Laughter, even brief, reminded the men of their humanity, fortitude, and the faint life beyond mud, machinery, and the unceasing hum of survival. The tank moved steadily forward, its heavy tracks crushing the scarred earth, each turn a reminder of the relentless rhythm of war. Fields pocked with craters, shattered roads, and ruined villages extended into the distance, yet small signs of life persisted. A bird hopping across rubble, a fox slinking cautiously between debris, or a distant figure attempting to navigate the remains of a farm. These fleeting glimpses of life beyond the tank offered moments of reflection, a reminder that the world continued despite the destruction surrounding them. The crew's eyes often lingered on these small, stubborn signs, a mental reprieve from the oppressive machinery and constant vigilance. Inside, the tank remained a claustrophobic ecosystem vibrating with the pulse of engines, hydraulics, and metal. The air was thick with sweat, oil, and dust, occasionally scented by tea or the faint aroma of preserved rations. Breathing became deliberate, conscious, a reminder that each inhalation was survival under confinement. The tank itself communicated subtly, groans, shudders, vibrations, and hisses formed a language the men learned to read instinctively. Each cue could indicate mechanical strain, approaching danger, or terrain challenges. Understanding them was essential for life and function. Meals were scarce but critical, a temporary oasis amid monotony and stress. Standard rations, canned meat, hard bread, dried vegetables, were supplemented whenever possible with scavenged items or rare supply drops. Even a small piece of chocolate or a few preserved potatoes became moments of celebration, a fragile reminder of normalcy. Tea, thin and bitter, was treasured for warmth and ritual. Conversation during meals varied from light humor to reflections on home, binding the men together and reinforcing camaraderie that was as essential as ammunition or mechanical skill. Hierarchy inside the tank was rigid but relied on coordination, skill, and trust. The commander directed maneuvers, yet success depended on the seamless interplay of driver, gunner, and loader. Orders were often conveyed through gestures, glances, or timing, a silent choreography honed over time. Mistakes were dangerous, sometimes fatal, yet experience and mutual understanding allowed the crew to function almost as a single entity, blending intuition with mechanical precision to survive in the ever-changing battlefield environment. Stories and rumors thrived within the tank, shaping perceptions and morale. Tales of improbable survival, daring feats, and strange or inexplicable occurrences were shared repeatedly, mixing truth and exaggeration. Even the most fantastical anecdotes served a purpose: mental rehearsal, cautionary illustration, or simple distraction from endless routine. Storytelling became a vital psychological mechanism, providing cohesion, preparation, and emotional sustenance amid uncertainty. Sleep was intermittent and uneasy. The cramped interior forced men into awkward positions, curled against metal or one another, blankets mingled with grime and oil. Dreams intruded unpredictably, reflecting external chaos or warping memories into surreal imagery. Awakening demanded alertness, as even the slightest noise, vibration, or shadow could require immediate action. The crew gradually mastered the art of partial rest, developing resilience through repeated exposure to fatigue, stress, and the continuous demands of survival. Outside, the world alternated between destruction and persistence. Bombed villages, cratered fields, and scarred forests existed alongside scavenging animals, resilient plants, and distant human activity. These glimpses of life offered grounding and perspective, a reminder of continuity beyond steel and mud. Longing and detachment intertwined, the men aware of life outside yet bound to machinery, routine, and survival. Maintenance was continuous, demanding constant attention. Tracks required alignment, engines oiling, bolts tightening, and mechanical issues improvisation. The crew's intimate knowledge of the tank became a survival skill, merging instinct, learned expertise, and resourcefulness. The machine was simultaneously protector and potential threat. Mastering it was inseparable from living another day. Communication remained subtle but essential. Glances, gestures, and brief words transmitted vital information, allowing the crew to act cohesively. Every motion carried consequence. minor errors could be fatal. Trust, coordination, and anticipation formed a web of interdependence, ensuring effective response under constant threat. Humor, though brief, persisted as a crucial thread. A whispered joke, sarcastic comment, or shared anecdote could temporarily lift tension, reinforcing camaraderie and sustaining morale. Laughter, even fleeting, reminded the crew of their humanity, resilience, and faint connection to a life beyond the tank, mud, and unceasing hum of survival.